Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The news as seen by the newspaper editors, very similar really. There's the Sunday Times Insight team. Big congratulations to them on their doping scandal story. If you watch the news report, you'll have seen that a huge amount of red wine will have appeared on the expense sheets of the Insight team. Money clearly very well spent. There's the Observer. They have a very interesting poll showing Brexit. The pro-leave the EU side of the argument is ahead, and particularly worrying for the Prime Minister, I suspect, is that younger voters are most pro-EU and also least likely to vote. We'll be perhaps talking about that in a moment. And then the Mail on Sunday has the main steel story, but it's actually about foreign aid. They're saying £172 million of foreign aid was overspent last year, above budgets, and that would have kept Port Talbot going for another 6 months. Sunday Telegraph there, again, another aid story, UK aid and the rigged election. That's a slightly separate story about an African state. And then the rest of the papers, basically sex, sex or sex. And we're not going to be talking much about any of them, are we? Right, and so to the Port Talbot story. I introduced you, Alison, as a South Wales woman.
Proud South Welsh girl,
Proud South woman. And you've chosen a spread in the Observer there, which is really about the human side, because we'll talk about economics in a minute, but this is about lots of people's lives and the community.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie and Paul are the economic experts and they'll be talking about that. I'm talking about a town I know very well. You come into it along the M4, you've got this giant plant. It's known as the Works locally. If you switch it off, you switch off life in that town. There are about 39,000 people who live there, already very, very challenged by their circumstances. The Observer's pointing out that when they shut the mines, lots of those communities did not revive. There's still incredible deprivation throughout there. And it's a town of great spirit. Paul and I were laughing earlier because they have produced Rob Brydon, Sir Anthony Hopkins, Richard Burton, Stanley Baker. So it's basically Eton. You know, Eton's got Tom Hiddleston, Damien Lewis, but Port Talbot has got these wonderful people. It's a place of great spirit, but they will kill it. And I feel so strongly that they do. South Wales does not need another kicking. There's going to be immense hardship and suffering. I think people from the southeast, if they went for a day trip there, would not believe the poverty. They need help.
Paul's talked a lot about the establishment based in London and the financial service industry is not quite getting what's going on down there.
It's not just people based in London. It's an ideology that says, you know, economics is about economics. Market logic determines what happens to the blast furnaces at Port Talbot. I think we have to take a different view. And in the papers today, we've got in the Telegraph, the Tories overnight seeming to come up with the beginning of an industrial policy. The local councils and the NHS are going to be urged to buy British steel. I think the key word there is urged.
Asked, not made.
Yeah, because, of course, you know, to make them do it, you would have to bend, float, or otherwise change EU law. But we're going to have to come up with some kind of an industrial strategy, because economics should be about people. It should be about producing coherent, solidaristic, nice communities. That's why we have economics.
Exactly. And isn't it the case that actually the French and the Germans bend the rules for their industries anyway? Well, we're just a bit naive about it.
Well, it's not just that. It isn't just about bending the rules. Sajid Javid and George Osborne went to Brussels and said, don't impose protective tariffs on British steel. Now, what this is, this NHS...
On Chinese steel.
On Chinese steel. What this is a protective measure against China, other people's steel. We want to buy our own steel. So why not now change the policy, go back to Brussels and say, right, slap a tariff on the Chinese. It's them who are flooding the market, not us.
Isn't that a fair point, Stephanie Flanders? Because people talk about a free market, but actually the Chinese are subsidising their steel industry massively and losing a huge amount on the steel they're importing.
This has been a challenge of geopolitics for the last few decades, because there's a lot of benefits that people get from China moving into the global economy and all of these sort of cheap goods that we've had. When we are thinking ourselves only as consumers, we tended to like all these free cheap goods flooding the market,
cheaper cars and cheaper washing machines,
cheaper toys, all of these things. But when it's hitting us as producers, it's obviously more challenging. And I think the government has got itself in a pickle if it doesn't have a strategy on the industrial side, but does have a very clear strategy on China, which many people say is a bit too
clear.
But in the meantime,
you've chosen the Sunday Telegraph business
the Sunday Telegraph is part of the more sort of mechanical business. It's all very well thinking about long-term, medium-term strategies, but right now they have to work out what to do with Port Talbot, whether there's any capacity to even put it in a holding operation, and that's where the steel tycoon Sanjeev Gupta comes in, because he has actually saved a number of British steel mills in the last few months.
And he's an amazing guy, very fast-talking, very bright, very persuasive.
Yeah, and I think he's saying, actually, in this piece, he's saying, look, I haven't made a proposition that I'm going to buy the whole thing, Tata Steel UK. That's far too big a thing to take on. But I think he does seem to be exploring with the government, can you keep parts of this open in order to start thinking about some of the things that Paul talked about? What is the strategic case for having any blast furnaces in the UK, for example?
Yes.
But doing this on the fly is a challenge.
I want to bring Paul into this because part of his idea is that you'd get rid of the blast furnaces and you'd move to something called electric arc furnaces, which basically use scrap steel to make new steel. You're against that as an idea. Why?
I'm not against it. I just think that, first of all, all melting of metal and pouring it into liquid takes a lot of energy. So you've got to have an energy policy, and then you've got to have a policy about where it goes. That is, I think a more coherent policy about who buys the steel. And this is what John McDonnell's talking about in page 10 of
the Mirror.
The Mirror. They've now come up with a plan. They've said bring forward some infrastructure projects so that we can use the steel on that. But above all, you've also got to take account of national security. Now, I think you can have national security and foreign ownership, but it's things like blast furnaces make, as it were, iron into steel. That's what they begin to do. And if you're in a geopolitically very scratchy situation, you have to ask governments to imagine what would happen if we suddenly needed some steel that we couldn't get from abroad. And you have to think about just that, and not even just the people of Port Talbot and the economics.
If we have a defence industry and we have a car industry, it makes sense that we have a steel industry, doesn't it? I mean, what happens if there is no steel industry and we have, as Paul says, the worst happens and there's a war and we suddenly need to make armaments?
These are all choices by government, and the Mail on Sunday has kind of collided two very different stories: foreign aid overspending and the steel story. Alison.
Yeah, the Mail on Sunday is running a very interesting campaign, which is against the sort of loony levels of foreign aid. Really, I think we're committed. The government committed to paying 0.07. Is that right?
Well, that's the UN target. We're one of the few countries that we've actually met it.
And I think there's this sort of sense that to appear virtuous and to sort of detoxify the Tory brand, that they were going to go big on foreign aid. But the Mail on Sunday is on its high horse and has got a very good campaign going. They've got a petition which has got more than 150,000 signatures, and they're saying that we overspent 172 million. But the point is, Andrew, surely, is that people are thinking, if we can't take care of our own people, what are we doing? And there's a very...
And just before we leave the Mail, there's a very interesting line about Bob Geldof in it, because it's alleged that David Cameron is so scared of Bob Geldof that he has protected the aid budget as a result, which is quite a result for an Irish former rocker.
Yes, everything's got to be run past the Bob. But I think not just the foreign aid, but what lots of people are saying in the country is, say what you like about the Welsh steelworkers, but they didn't bundle up a lot of dodgy mortgages and collapse the global financial system.
That be true.
And we managed to bail them out for 45 billion over 7 years ago.
100 billion.
Right.
100 billion. Oh, okay.
Kept the economy running.
Stephanie Flanders bailed out, not bailed out yourself, of course. You've got a great cartoon there from the Sunday Times.
Yes, the Sunday Times, the Gerald Scarf, and it sort of makes some of this point we were making earlier about just how all of this is really in response to what's the production that's been coming out of China. We benefited a lot from China's growth over the years, but now they have been pushing a lot of cheap steel onto the global market, and you see that threatening to stomp on David Cameron and the business secretary. Again, it's this issue of how do you maintain... The government has said that it really does want to have this very close relationship with China, and every country in the world is struggling with how to maintain that while also stopping these economic consequences.
So, Stephanie, you could actually have a perfectly coherent industrial strategy which said, you know what, we're much more interested in all of those steel-using manufacturers in the UK, the car makers and so forth. We therefore have decided to let British Steel go hang. That's what we're going to do. And that would be coherent, but of course the government won't say that.
I think the problem they have with all these things is if you could have a principled view, for example, against any kind of protectionism, which would actually put you at odds with parts of the EU as well as other people, or you can have a principled view that you should, exactly along the lines that you suggested. But to claim that you are now talking about the march of the makers and you are in favour of supporting industry and a rebalancing of the UK while doing exactly the opposite, that does seem slightly odd.
What about
Paul is bouncing up and down at the end of the sofa so vigorously.
It's becoming a government that says one thing and does another. But lurking behind all of that is the relationship with Europe, because it is absolutely logical for George Osborne to go and kowtow to China. If I think this has been going on for some time because the Conservatives thought, look, in or out of Europe, we're going to need to have bilateral relationships with the big industrial players of the future. And that's completely logical. I think a lot of people think that then, if you do that in a free market way, so the Chinese don't believe in the free market. They subsidise everything. They've just slapped tariffs onto a small steel plant in South Wales. So then that's going to play into this. This is the Observer story.
I want to talk about the Brexit story, because it's quite important, Paul.
Right now, the pro-Brexit part of the population, according to the latest poll, is winning by a bit. But when you drill down to it, and Andrew Rawnsley talks about this in the Observer, the old are in favour of Brexit, or more in favour of Brexit, and the young are not. We understand, according to the polls, which got everything wrong last year. And that's causing a bit of consternation, because we all know young people don't vote a lot. I think, though, we haven't even heard the offer we're going to be voting on. I think we'll have the same thing as we had in Scotland, a last-minute offer from you, and then all this kind of up and down in the YouGov polls will be irrelevant come down to the final week, what we actually get.
There is an irony there, because you've got older people actually are the ones who want to be radical on this. They like the idea of just throwing all the rules up in the air and then seeing what happens afterwards. The young people, I would say, are being much more sensible and not wanting to put it all at risk.
So you're a Remainer. Alison, you are a signed-up Brexiter.
I'm a signed-up Brexiter, and I object to being described as older. I mean, the sensible middle-aged who've had a chance to live. I should say that my son, who's 16, wants to stay because he sees all the benefits of being able to go and work in Paris or Berlin or whatever.
He's going to live with more of the consequences, I'm sorry to say, than you are.
Well, I think we are living with the consequences, and I am for Brexit on the grounds of the fact we cannot take care of our own people. Our services are under vast strain, and we've got 320,000 people a year coming in. How are we going to look after them?
Those are the crucial. You got into a little bit of hot water, it's fair to say, I think, last week when you said that actually after the Brussels attack that we would be safer physically outside the EU. Why did you say that?
Because I think that's the case. I think our security services are doing a fantastic job. They're fighting day after day to keep us safe, and I think that there are very weak elements in European security services.
With the other European security departments.
Well, I think that the Belgian police are finding out more from our lot than they are from their own people, and I think that there are serious security lapses. And people have cut. Two of the terrorists, one from Paris, one from Brussels, came to Birmingham in the last 2 years.
Paul, sorry, I'm going to. Before you say anything, you are, I think it's fair to say, broadly speaking, on the left, and you haven't yet come out pro-Brexit.
I'm not broadly speaking on the left. I am absolutely on the radical left.
You're right on the radical left.
Can I just say, Stephanie and I are fighting bitterly over him. One says, "Stay, go, stay,
okay,
go."
yeah, no,
it's
but
like,
I know. No, I mean, I buy all the principled arguments in favour of leaving. I don't think we can democratise the European Union. I think that, however, what stays my hand, and I'm going to wait and see what we're offered, is the idea of kind of the Keystone Cops of Javid and Cameron, as demonstrated on this, being replaced by Boris, and then Boris gets to decide, Boris Johnson, I think we should start calling him, gets to decide the terms on which we leave. That is what's making me think.
There's a genuine point here, which is made in some of the other papers as well, that there is a view that it's not, if it's young people don't vote, and specifically if Labour people don't vote, we could end up leaving. And I think it will be many on the left who will end up suffering as a result of that.
We've talked about lots and lots of very, very big issues. You've got Women's Hour before we end.
There's a wonderful bit of archive which we have. I'm trying to see which paper it is. In the Mail on Sunday. When they started Women's Hour on the BBC, there was great concern. They decided it couldn't be fronted by a woman because they might be resented by women listeners. But there's just this sort of fantastic... The programme was originally for middle-class housewives who don't want their brains to go mouldy. So we've been protected from that. But it's wonderful they have a memo from someone saying that he's rather embarrassed by talking about older women's programmes in the afternoon. Acutely embarrassing to hear about hot flushes and diseases of the ovaries broadcasting at 376 kilowatts at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
You'll never hear that on BBC One these days.
So now we can talk about ovaries.
Absolutely.
Menopause round the clock, basically.
Enough. I'm having a hot flush. Very, very thought. Thank you all very much. Great paper review.
I've been